Have you ever noticed how the United States ended up with one of the biggest territories on Earth, even though it started as just a skinny strip of land on the Atlantic coast? It sounds almost impossible, right? How does a country go from smaller than modern-day Mexico to stretching across two oceans and even grabbing lands thousands of miles away? The truth is, it didn't happen by accident. It happened through bold gambles, messy wars, and deals so controversial that people called them foolish until they paid off beyond anyone's imagination. What most people don't realize is that every new piece of land didn't just add miles to a map. It added resources, opportunities, and ultimately the backbone of what would become an American superpower. And here's the kicker. Some of the turning points in this story are still barely known outside history classrooms. That's why, if you stick with me until the end, you'll not only see how the U.S. pieced together this vast territory, you'll also understand why that land is still at the very core of America's global power today. When people look at the United States territory today, they often underestimate just how massive it really is. With nearly 9.8 million square kilometers, it stands as the third largest nation in the world, right behind Russia and Canada. To put that in perspective, it's bigger than the entire European Union combined. That kind of landmass isn't just about bragging rights. It's about the kind of power and opportunities that come with controlling such a vast space. Now, the funny thing is, America didn't start off anywhere near that size. Back in the late 18th century, it was basically a collection of 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast, smaller than today's Mexico. Imagine trying to run a global empire from a sliver of land squeezed between the ocean and a mountain range. That was the reality. The story of how those colonies grew into a continental giant was a saga of bold deals, messy wars, and a mindset that said, why stop here when we can keep going? Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. The more territory the U.S. picked up, the more momentum it gained. That momentum didn't just shape geography, it fueled ambition, created resources, and laid the foundation for becoming an American superpower. And while the story begins with those 13 fragile colonies, the real turning point that doubled the nation overnight was about to arrive in the early 1800s. The United States territory started off modestly, just those 13 colonies lined up along the Atlantic coast. Life there was tough, forests to clear, rivers to cross, and constant tension with European rivals like Britain, France, and Spain. At that point, nobody could have predicted this small coastal nation would one day stretch from ocean to ocean. But the seeds of ambition were already there, nurtured by leaders who believed expansion wasn't just possible, it was necessary for survival. Then came the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a deal so shocking it almost seemed reckless at the time. For $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, President Thomas Jefferson bought a chunk of land from France that doubled the country's size overnight. We're talking about a massive 828 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. To give you a sense of scale, that's bigger than modern-day India. And while Jefferson himself wondered if the Constitution even allowed such a purchase, he knew an opportunity like that comes once in a lifetime. The Louisiana Purchase did more than add land. It set the tone for what would come next. It showed Americans that bold moves could change the game, and it created a roadmap for future acquisitions. Much like an investor who buys undervalued stock that later skyrockets, Jefferson's gamble paid off beyond anyone's imagination. And once the U.S. got a taste at how transformative expansion could be, the idea of pushing further west became more than just strategy. It became destiny. By the mid-1800s, a new idea started to sweep across the nation: manifest destiny. It was the belief that the United States territory was destined, almost divinely ordained, to stretch from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. This mindset wasn't just about land grabs. It reflected a cultural confidence that expansion meant progress, freedom, and opportunity. But of course, that vision often came at the expense of Native American tribes, who faced forced removals and broken treaties as settlers pushed westward. The westward expansion took on a life of its own. Families packed up their wagons and traveled along the Oregon Trail, braving disease, harsh weather, and the sheer unknown. Imagine leaving everything behind for a 6-month trek, not knowing if you'd make it or what you'd find when you arrived. Yet the promise of fertile farmland, gold, and a fresh start kept the stream of pioneers flowing. Historical records show that by 1860, nearly 300,000 people had crossed the plains to settle in Oregon, California, and beyond. This movement reshaped the map, but it also reshaped the national psyche. Every new settlement, every mile of railroad track, reinforced the sense that the U.S. wasn't just growing, it was fulfilling a mission. The West wasn't the end of expansion, but rather a stepping stone that led to even more ambitious pursuits, especially when Texas and the Southwest came into the picture. By the 1830s, the spotlight turned south, where Texas had broken away from Mexico and declared itself an independent republic. For nearly a decade it stood alone, but American settlers living there pushed hard for Texas annexation into the Union. In 1845, Washington finally agreed, but that decision lit the fuse for conflict. Mexico saw the move as theft, and tensions escalated into what would become one of the most consequential wars in U.S. history. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, was brutal, but its outcome completely reshaped the map. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded nearly half of its territory, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Think about that. In one stroke, the United States territory expanded by more than 500,000 square miles. California alone would later fuel the economy with its gold rush, agriculture, and eventually tech industry. It was a territorial jackpot, but also a controversial prize. This wave of land acquisition highlighted both the ambition and the contradictions of the era. On one hand, it strengthened the U.S. path toward becoming an American superpower. On the other, it deepened divisions over slavery, governance, and national identity. Still, the hunger for land didn't stop at the Southwest. Soon, eyes shifted northward and across the Pacific, toward the Oregon Territory, the frozen wilderness of Alaska, and the distant islands of Hawaii. While the dust was settling in the Southwest, another negotiation was taking shape up north. The Oregon Territory had long been disputed between Britain and the United States. In 1846, both sides agreed to split the land at the 49th parallel, giving the U.S. what would become Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana. It was a diplomatic win, proving expansion didn't always require bloodshed. The deal also opened the gateway to the Pacific Northwest, with its dense forests, rivers, and ports that would later fuel trade. A few decades later, Washington pulled off what critics mocked as Seward's folly. In 1867, Secretary of State William H. Seward negotiated the Alaska Purchase from Russia for $7.2 million. At first, people laughed. Why buy a frozen wilderness thousands of miles away? But Alaska turned out to be rich in oil, gold, and fisheries, a reminder that long-term vision often outshines short-term skepticism. In hindsight, it was one of the smartest bargains in U.S. history, second only to the Louisiana Purchase. Then came Hawaii, annexed in 1898 after years of growing American influence in the islands. Its location was priceless, right in the middle of the Pacific, serving as both a military stronghold and a commercial hub. Sugar plantations brought wealth, while Pearl Harbor would later anchor U.S. naval power. With Hawaii, the United States wasn't just expanding its borders, it was stepping into the role of a global presence. And by then, the stage was set for a new identity, the leap from a continental power to an American superpower. Looking back, the journey from the 13 colonies to a vast continental giant feels almost unreal. Each expansion, whether through purchase, war, or diplomacy, was like stacking bricks on a foundation, building the United States territory into what it is today. By the 20th century, America wasn't just large on a map, it held an unmatched advantage in resources, agriculture, and strategic geography. Those assets fueled industrial growth, military reach, and the ability to project influence worldwide. The sheer size of the land provided more than just room to grow. It gave access to gold in California, oil in Texas and Alaska, fertile fields in the Midwest, and ports that connected to both the Atlantic and Pacific. This abundance wasn't luck. It was the direct result of bold decisions like the Louisiana Purchase, the Texas annexation, and the Alaska Purchase. With each step, the U.S. strengthened its backbone, preparing itself for the 20th century's challenges. But the real story lies in identity. Expansion wasn't just about geography. It created a national character built on ambition, restlessness, and resilience. From Manifest Destiny to Hawaii annexation, Americans developed a mindset that land meant opportunity, and opportunity meant power. That's why the U.S. didn't just stay a continental power. It evolved into an American superpower, with global influence that can still be traced back to every mile of land it gained. So, when we trace the journey from the 13 colonies to a continental giant,
It becomes clear. The story of the United States territory isn't just about land, it's about identity. Each purchase, each annexation, each war, and even each gamble gave the U.S. the size, resources, and positioning to grow into an American superpower. The blueprint of its global influence is literally written across its map. Now, here's the big question for you. Which of these expansions do you think had the biggest impact? The Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, or the Alaska Purchase? And do you believe the U.S. could have become a superpower without them? I'd love to hear your perspective because history always sparks debate. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to keep learning about how nations rise, fall, and transform, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the next deep dive into the forces that shape our world.